My name is Jen. I'm in my 40s and my friend and I run a business via Airbnb here in the UK. We own a few different properties across London, and while my friend acts as the financial backing, I do the day-to-day business of dealing with repairs and guest inquiries, as well as inspecting the rentals both before the guests arrive and after they check out. As you can imagine, summertime is our busiest period of the year, with business also picking up a lot around Christmas too. We always have this really quiet period around autumn time, where we struggle to break even. It really puts a dent in the annual profits. Imagine our joy when last year, we got a 3-week-long booking for one of our swankier properties in North London. It was a huge payday for us, even with the block discount that Airbnb mandates, and we try to be as welcoming and accommodating as possible to increase the chance of repeat stays. For those of you that have used Airbnb before, you know that the vast majority of rentals are completely no contact. That style has really only increased over the course of the pandemic. That means that we didn't meet our renters even once, and throughout the whole 3-week stay, we didn't receive a single call or contact attempt from them either. The only thing we knew for sure was that one of the 2 guests was a girl named Alice. Alice had paid the deposit, the rental fee, everything. About halfway through their stay, I dropped a text to Alice to ask if everything was going okay. I received no reply other than, "Fine, thanks." We assumed their stay was going wonderfully. I certainly wasn't complaining very much. Low-maintenance guests were a help, because as much as I don't mind helping out where and when I'm needed, there's nothing worse than a person who calls you up every 5 minutes asking where things are and claiming things are broken when they just don't know how to use them. When their 3 weeks were over, I made my way over to the flat to make sure everything was still in order. Not that I was expecting anything to be in rough shape though. Maybe a few towels left on the floor, a full bin bag or something. The usual minor stuff people leave behind when they're in a hurry to get out of there. We'd had someone make a real mess of one of the flats recently though, after having an all-night party, so I was ready to be greeted by an absolute horror show. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found that day though. I knew something was wrong almost immediately after trying to get inside to check. There seemed to be something blocking the door from the other side. It took a few good hard shoves to get it to move. Then I saw further inside someone had piled up chairs against some of the doors as a means of slowing down entry as well, but not completely barring access. I also noticed how cold it was inside. That was the first hint that I got that someone had left all the windows open, something we specifically asked guests not to do, since the area had something of a pigeon problem. I rather quickly deduced that whoever had tried to bar the door had done so, then used a window to actually leave the flat. Why in God's name they'd want to do that though was a complete mystery to me, at least for the next few minutes anyway. I walked into the living room to shut the window. That's when I saw the mess they'd made. But unlike the mess that partiers leave behind, which tends to be loads of empty bottles and cans, cigarette butts, that sort of thing, this time it looked like there had been some sort of fight. Loads of glasses and plates were smashed, the chairs were wrecked, the tables were overturned. It was a complete mess. The next place I decided to check was the bedroom, deciding to leave the bathroom until last. I was honestly dreading whatever had been left in there. Seeing the state the bedroom had been left in just made me dread it even more. There were all kinds of empty condom wrappers all over the bedroom, as well as adult toys strewn everywhere. The sheets had stains on them. God knows what they'd come from. The whole room just reeked of you-know-what. It was disgusting. Finally, though, I braced myself to check the bathroom and see what kind of mess had been left behind in there. I was expecting something god-awful that I'd probably have to spend the rest of the morning cleaning. But like I said, I could have never been ready for what was behind that door. I pushed open the door slightly, took a peek inside, then immediately slammed it closed, after seeing something lying motionless in the bath. Something person-shaped. I say person-shaped because just from the split second I'd seen that, it didn't look like a person, not a living one anyway. They were lumpy and covered in gore, almost like they'd been butchered and the meat piled on top of each other. I think I was in denial about what I was seeing at first. I mean, I didn't want it to be what it was, so in those few moments, I tried to think of everything it could have been instead of facing reality. I don't know what actually drove me to open the door again. I certainly didn't want to. I think I'd actually managed to convince myself it was a hallucination or something. I just assumed the worst after seeing the rest of the place. It surely couldn't be as bad as I thought it was. Only, it was as bad as I thought it was. If anything, it was worse. There was a body lying there in the bath, probably in the worst condition you can imagine. Part of the reason I refused to recognize it immediately is because this girl's face was so beaten that you couldn't even recognize her as a human being anymore. There wasn't a single patch of skin that didn't have blood drying on it, but it wasn't that brown, old-looking blood that had long since clotted. It looked kind of fresh, like they'd been there for only a few hours at most. I immediately pulled my phone out, dialing 999 to tell them I needed police as quickly as possible. The girl, who I assume was the girl who'd rented from us, was laying there perfectly still. I couldn't hear her breathing or anything. I just assumed she was dead. I even told the bloke on the other end of the line that I was almost certain. And that's when he asked me to check her pulse to make sure. I did as he asked, 100% certain there would not be a thing. In my mind, there was no one on Earth that could survive the kind of violence I was seeing right here. I don't even think I was touching the right spot on her neck at first. I couldn't feel a single thing. After racking my brain for a minute trying to remember the girl's name, I think I just blanked because of the panic. I just said out loud, "Alice?" She then opened her eyes. It was almost like she'd properly come back from the dead or something. That was the single most terrifying moment of my life. It was horrendous. Her eyes were all bloodshot. One of them had no white in it whatsoever. It was just a bright red mess of broken blood vessels. As soon as she laid eyes on me, she started screaming and lashing out. I ran out of the flat and into the corridor outside, shouting, "She's still alive!" down the phone. After that, I had to run back upstairs to make sure the girl didn't leave by herself. She had obviously launched into fight-or-flight mode after waking up, and must have thought she was still in danger. When I got back upstairs, she was half naked, slouched in the hallway, crying her eyes out. I told her to stay put, and an ambulance was on the way. All she could do was cry, while blood poured down her face. That's another image I'll never get out of my head. How her tears actually seemed to be just blood. When the paramedics arrived, I found out the only reason she hadn't run off after waking up screaming was because she literally couldn't. I don't know what kind of damage had been done to her legs, but the paramedics had to bring in a stretcher just to get her down into the ambulance. After she was taken to the hospital, a second set of policemen asked me to stay out of the flat on behalf of a forensics team, which were on their way down then. They proceeded to ask me questions regarding exactly what I'd seen and what I knew about the people renting. Obviously, I knew next to nothing other than the person's name and the amount of time they were staying for. Still, I answered the questions best I could. They promised to keep me in the loop regarding certain details so I could pass them on to our insurance company for the eventual claim we were going to file. About a week or so later, I got a call from an officer. While he didn't tell me exactly what happened, he told me everything he was permitted to. Basically, the two girls who'd rented the flat were call girls. They would often come down from the north to use the place as a kind of base of operations because they could charge more for their services in London than they could up north. At least, that was their logic for this little venture. Apparently, their idea had worked out really well, and they'd had a profitable, relatively trouble-free first few weeks. Then, though, on the night before they'd been due to check out, some local gangsters got wind of their little operation and didn't take too kindly. Apparently, they were charging quite a bit of money, but still lower than the gangsters had agreed upon for all their girls. The gangsters hatched a little plan. They would raid the flat the girls were staying in, scare them enough to leave the area, and take any money they'd made in the process. Thing was, the girls didn't keep the money in the flat with them. They were taking the cash to a friend of theirs who just so happened to live in London too. That's how only one girl ended up getting left behind. She ended up being the only one they beat the crap out of and tortured as a means of scaring the other girl. They'd forced her out the window before making her lead them to where they'd stashed their money. That's all I was told, and as much as the officer hinted that they got a few blokes in custody, they obviously couldn't tell me who they were or who they were affiliated with. That was the single worst incident in the history of our little Airbnb business, and probably one of the worst things I'd ever come across in my entire life. Okay, so a few years back, me and my girlfriend decided to get out of the city for a few days by renting an Airbnb. We spent a while looking at a bunch of different places and finally settled in this place on a farm, about a 2-hour drive out of the city. It was this little guest house on a farm just across from the main house, where the owners must have lived. We talked a little via email after actually paying for the place. Just little things like if we wanted some wine or coffee left for our arrival. The owners were very friendly like that. Just a few days before we were due to drive out there though, they suddenly stopped replying to all our emails. It was a little worrying, but not hugely so. I mean, we'd already paid all our fees and stuff, so we were definitely entitled to rent the little guest house for the week we'd paid for. Besides, we figured they were just busy or something, and would get back to us as soon as they could. They told us in one email that the keys to the place would be in a lockbox that was attached to the place's porch. They'd email us the code on either the day before we arrived or the day of our arrival, for security reasons. Like I'd said though, they seemed to just totally go dark just a few days before, and they ended up not emailing us any kind of code. We were kind of annoyed, as anyone might be, as we'd already paid all the money and all that. I know we probably should have just canceled the trip and got a refund from Airbnb, but we really liked the idea of staying on this small farm. It would make the perfect little break from our busy urban lives, so we decided to just roll the dice. Drive out there and get the code to the lockbox by knocking at the actual farmhouse, instead of relying on email and stuff. The place was relatively easy to find, and both the farmhouse and the little guest house looked awesome. There was just one problem though. The door to the main house was wide open. There was a trail of clothes and household items, all leading up to a spot that it looked like a truck or car had once sat. As you can guess, we could instantly tell something was not right. It looked like whoever had lived there had left in a hurry for some reason. Just to be sure, we walked up to the door and knocked on it, even though it was already open. We called out and tried to get anyone's attention. We didn't receive a reply, so there was definitely no one home. We didn't actually have any of their numbers. There was no getting in touch with them to find out what happened or when they'd be back. Not that we actually thought they'd be coming back anytime soon. Actually, the trail of stuff gave us a pretty good idea that no one would be returning at all. The real questions we were faced with was why the hell did the family leave in such a hurry? What scared them so bad they'd left so fast? We didn't exactly stick around for very long. You could just feel the bad vibes hanging in the air, and my girlfriend was begging me to get us out of there, almost from the moment we'd left the car. And the time we were there, we didn't see any blood or anything like that. Nothing to indicate what had happened at all. We made sure to call the cops on the way back into the city, just to let them know something was up here, if they didn't already know. Getting our money back was much easier than we figured too. I guess they couldn't get in touch with the family either. Since it was still the day we were due to check in, I guess the money was still in digital limbo or something, so they got us a refund pretty quickly. I always wondered what happened. since we didn't end up getting any real answers about it, other than the fact we got our money back pretty quickly. I'm guessing that meant they didn't contest the refund with Airbnb. We've rented since then too, with none of that same creepiness being repeated. I definitely recommend using the company, but I suppose you just don't know what you're walking into until you actually arrive there. A few years ago now, me and a friend of mine got an Airbnb in Berlin for the weekend. A converted attic with 2 beds and some basic accommodations. The first night at around 4 a.m., I heard some footsteps walking up the final staircase, which led directly to the door of the attic. The next thing I knew, I saw the door slowly begin peeling open, as if someone was trying to sneak inside. I got this immediate gut punch feeling of terror, realizing I'd forgotten to lock the door. I just laid there, with my eyes glued to the doorway as it continued to slowly open. I called out, thinking it was a friend trying to mess with me or something. No response. The door stopped inching open. I called out again and again, but whoever was on the other side refused to answer. All of a sudden, the door swung wide open, slamming hard against the wall. I could see a shadow outline of a person, distorted by the darkness behind them and illuminated by the window slightly. I went into full fight-or-flight mode and sprang up onto the bed. I grabbed a nearby lamp to use as a weapon, and I swung it while running around the figure. After what felt like a few minutes, but was probably just a split second, I found myself with a clear path to the doorway, weaving around the figure into the subsequent staircase. I threw the lamp behind me at the intruder and flew down all 3 flights of stairs with so much energy. I was lucky not to fall and kill myself. I shook awake my friend immediately and told her we had to leave right now. I called the cops and said she had to come with me. A few minutes later, my other friends arrived. The cops arrived too. They told us the place was all clear, but we were idiots for leaving the door open and trashing the place. We had left the door open, but we'd never trashed it. That must have been the intruder. I never stayed in another dodgy place like that ever again. I wouldn't even if you paid me. It all started when my friend invited me to his house for the evening to stay over until the next morning. I had to be at his place around 9 p.m., so his parents could inform us of all the rules before they left for the evening. Unfortunately, I hadn't kept track of the time very well and arrived 15 minutes late because of this. Once we got to his place, we were all alone. His parents had seemingly already left. Later that evening, my friend decided to go downstairs to pee and get something to eat. After about 10 minutes though, he still hadn't returned yet. I went down to check what was going on when I saw my friend there, totally asleep on the sofa, with his parents. I should point out I'd never met his parents in person before this. They immediately told me that my friend, once he'd arrived downstairs, sat down on the sofa and collapsed from exhaustion. His parents took him upstairs to his bed to sleep. I was pretty tired as well, so I was just about to go to bed too. Right before I did so though, I received a notification message. The message said, "We're on the road, hope the house isn't a mess already." When I received this message, I immediately knew the parents that had been downstairs were not my friend's real parents. I had to come up with some sort of plan, but with the fear and stress, it was pretty hard to think in that moment. I called the fake parents and said there was a leak in the bathroom that wouldn't stop. They went upstairs, and once in the bathroom, I grabbed my friend and hid us in the garden shed. Once inside, I called my friend's parents and then the police, announcing what was going on. About 10 minutes later, the police and parents arrived, and my friend had finally woken up. I told him what was going on and opened the door for the police, telling them the story as well. About a week later, I heard back about the case. The people had not been found. but in the kitchen they found some very strong sleeping pills, as well as various pieces of rope and tape. Since that incident, I always make sure I meet my friends' parents before I ever try to sleep over at their houses. I have a pretty small motorboat that I like to take out on the river for fishing. It's not a very fast boat, but it doesn't really have to be in order to catch fish. Fishing was my favorite thing to do, and I always liked to do it alone. There were also times I would do it late into the evening and spend the whole night out on the river. It was just what I found to be the most entertaining. This was a late summer day when I decided to go out and fish yet again. It was around the time when there were less boats out on the water, either because people had gotten tired of it already or because it was not hot enough for them to be out still. When it got dark, it could get a little cold out on the lake, and it could be quite overwhelming for some. Anyway, like I said, there weren't many boats out. When the sun began setting, there were absolutely none at all except for mine. I decided I wanted to stay out on the river though. I really liked the solitude. It was nice and peaceful. Right when it was getting fully dark, I was moving further down the river. I was going towards a part that was a little slimmer shore to shore. Even though I was alone, I began getting these weird feelings that someone was watching me. Due to the weather drop, a foggy mist had begun forming on the river. It was quite an eerie thing to experience, and it increased that creepy feeling of me being watched. I kept on looking over to the shores, which were littered with trees and shrubbery. I kept expecting to see a figure standing there, but as the sun was still going down, I didn't see anything. I thought it must be all in my head. I mean, it was a creepy atmosphere that I was in, and it was probably playing tricks on my mind as well. Finally, when it was fully dark, I began to feel even more creeped out. At that point though, I couldn't see anything on shore unless I used my spotlight on it, even if I wanted to. It was dark for a little while, before something did finally catch my eye. There was a brief flicker of light on the right shore. It wasn't like a firefly or anything like that though. When I looked over to it, it was clearly the signs of a flashlight. It appeared someone was flicking it on and off, pointed right over towards me. Before I even had a chance to be worried though, I caught another flashlight, flickering on the other side of the river. Looking over there, I noticed multiple lights flicking on and off. My anxiety began to rise very quickly. I took my spotlight and shined it over where I saw the lights flicking. I noticed more than one person, moving silently along the side of the shore. They were hiding behind trees, while flicking their lights towards me. I couldn't tell much about them, but they all seemed to be wearing camo for some reason. They were definitely shining their lights at me specifically. Looking on the other shore, I noticed the same thing. At this point, I began to get really scared. As I was going down the river, they were doing their best to keep pace with me. Whatever they were up to, I couldn't imagine it would be anything good. It was so creepy. All I wanted to do was get going. My boat wasn't fast, but it could definitely go faster than I had been going. I put the boat up to full speed, doing my best to get back to the dock that my truck was at as quickly as possible. At first, the lights on the shores kept following me. They were definitely focused on me specifically. I didn't want to find out the reason for that. Despite my boat's slow speed, it was easier for me going down the river water than it was for them to walk throughout all the shrubbery and stuff. Still though, I noticed there were tons of lights on both sides of the river. They kept flicking on and off, and it made me realize there must have been more than a dozen people out there chasing me. It was terrifying, but I was fortunate to be going with the flow of the river, not against it. This helped me to eventually be lucky enough to outrun them. Eventually, the flickering of the lights was way behind me. I got to my dock and tried to load my boat on my truck so I could leave. I was creeped out the entire time though. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me, or something like that. I kept searching around, seeing if there were any more flickering lights out there. I didn't see any as I got in my truck and took off towards home. I didn't feel comfortable until I was back on the main road. I often still fish in that area, but now I always leave before it gets dark. I have no idea what was going on that night, but I think I'm pretty lucky I didn't really have to find out. A few people may be aware that I was engaged once before I met my current husband in early 2000. I was working in IT for a company in Denver, and this is when I first met Mark. We flirted for several months before he got the nerve to ask me out. After that, the relationship quickly became serious. Later that year, I moved in with him. Only a few months after that, he proposed, and I tearfully accepted. The stress of planning the wedding had left us both overwhelmed. When the time came for us to take our vacations, we chose a camp out in the Rockies. Flying anywhere made us both nervous. I picked out a spot about an hour away, and we set up camp. We arrived late on our first day and stuck close to the camp area. After a quick breakfast the next morning, we went out for a hike. The trail was a bit overgrown, but it was still completely usable. Neither of us had brought any water or snacks for the journey, and we had very little knowledge of bushcraft. I don't recall Mark ever even talking about it. As a pair, we would be completely hopeless if we ever got lost. So, as is often the case, that's exactly what happened. I had picked the place because I'd heard about an awesome pair of waterfalls. I didn't know exactly where they were, but I knew they were close by. We could even hear them faintly in the distance. As we went along, the trail split off at some point. The new trail was even rougher, but to our ears it was in the direction of the falls. We followed for a long time, but the sound never got any louder. I suggested we go off to the left. We'd surely run into the falls then, or at least a trail that led to it. Mark was reluctant, but agreed without much argument. After 15 minutes of fighting our way through brush and trees, we finally ran into another more developed trail. We were sure we were back on track now. However, a mile or more later, we were now no closer than before. We were both tired and just wanted to get back to camp. We turned around and followed the trail back a few miles. The assumption was we'd eventually run into the original trail that led back to camp. Only there was no sign of it as we continued along. We weren't yet concerned, though. Another hour passed by, and we still hadn't intersected with the trail. That was the exact moment we knew we were lost. The sound of water had faded long ago. I thought we had just missed our turn. If we went back the way we came, we had to hit it. It was 2:15 p.m. when we turned around. The next time I looked at my watch, it was 3:25, and we were still no closer. This is when the fear began to take over me. By that point in the day, everything had become a jumble. I was tired, hungry, and most of all, very thirsty. Mark had become uncharacteristically quiet, and this made things even worse. I became a panicked and ranting mess. Eventually, Mark had enough and screamed to shut up in my face. It worked. I sat down and listened as Mark calmly laid out a plan. We could eventually hear the falls again, so we had to be close. We would follow the sound through the trees until we reached the falls. We would not take any trails or shortcuts. Logic dictated we would have to run into them eventually. Once we made it there, we would stay and wait until another tourist arrived, then follow them out. If it was dark when we arrived, we would spend a night there and wait until someone arrived the next morning. That's just what we did. We would finally reach the falls just before dark. I was so happy to have water, I forgot how long we'd been lost. Little did I know, though, the hardest part was still ahead. A fire was out of the question. Everything was back at camp, and neither Mark or I knew how to start one. We curled up together and tried to sleep. The hours seemed to pass like years. The night got colder and colder, and no matter how close we got together, it was never enough to stay warm. I began to violently shiver, and at some point I could feel myself drifting away. Relief soon gave way to fear. A little voice inside me said that if I fell asleep, I would not wake up. I turned over and started shaking Mark to wake him up. It was very hard. He was angry and asked what I was doing. I told him my fears, but he didn't want to listen. He started drifting off again, but I wouldn't let him. This made him furious. He flew into an angry, screaming rant about shivering keeping you alive. It made no sense, but it did give me an idea. I decided to make things worse by bringing up something we had long ago dropped. This made Mark livid. The fight went on for hours from there. I kept the fight going as long as I could. Mark eventually caught on and laid back down, though. We laughed about it and talked about our plans for the future. My idea turned out to backfire on us, though. We were so exhausted from the argument we couldn't stay awake any longer. I fought the urge to sleep for as long as I could, but at some point I began to slip away. Next thing I remember, someone was shaking me and screaming. I didn't want to wake up, but they kept at it until I had to. My eyes eventually opened to the sun shining down and a middle-aged man talking to me. My head ached, and my vision was blurry. I sat up and looked behind me. We couldn't explain much to the man other than we'd gotten lost, and just like Mark had planned, the gentleman and his wife walked us back to our camp. The trip was soon over. We packed as fast as we could and drove back to Denver. We spent the rest of it under a big comforter in bed. We probably should have chosen that from the start. I carry a lighter with me now wherever I go, even if it's just a trip to the store. I never want to be that cold again. An ill feeling between Mark and I spawned from that trip, although it was never said. Mark seemed to be holding a grudge against me afterward. I had been the one who chose the location and suggested the shortcut in the woods after all. I'd also brought up something he believed was buried between us. It may have eaten away at him after he had time to think about it. He made backhanded comments about me on that trip more than once. A few times he did it in front of our friends as well, and over time it drove a wedge between us. In late 2002 we went our separate ways, and haven't spoken since. I harbor no ill will towards him. That was a long time ago, and it's not really important. I wanted to share my story to illustrate the importance of getting basic survival instruction and preparing for every possible emergency. I hope the seriousness of the situation drives the point home to you. Whether it's about wilderness survival or changing a tire, I discovered that preparedness is always your best option. You'll never regret it. Just yesterday, my mother and I received some news we hoped we'd never get. According to Brazilian and U.S. officials, a set of remains were discovered in a shallow grave near some small, unnamed village. Several tests were done, including dental comparisons, and they were determined to belong to my oldest brother, Raphael. We had lost contact with him in late 2017. The story of what happened during that period still has a lot of holes that need to be filled, but this is what little we think we know. Growing up, Raphael had always been very close to my father. When he passed away from cancer when Raphael was 15, he lost his way. Much of his next 10 years were spent searching. At 25, he was more aimless than ever. A friend suggested he join the army, and this turned out to be a blessing. Surrounded by all sorts of strong leadership, he learned to become his own person. After 2 combat deployments, he left the military in a far better state. He wasn't quite ready to give up helping others yet, though. He found a non-profit, providing aid to indigenous groups throughout Central and South America. Raphael joined them and remained with them for 3 years. During this time, he had made a lot of friends. Many he stayed in contact with when he returned to America. After he left the non-profit, he traveled the country and explored quite a bit. He slept on friends' couches, worked odd jobs. This is the point at which we lost contact with him. It wasn't out of the ordinary to go long periods without speaking to him. We were confident in his ability to take care of himself. After not hearing from him for more than half a year, though, my mom and I became very concerned. We contacted every friend we knew of and got no real answers, at least not at first. A week went by. and we received a call back from one of Raphael's co-workers within the aid group. Through another person, he was contacted and told Raphael that he had taken a vacation trip back to Brazil to see some friends. A man he met online joined him. The friends in Brazil verified that Raphael went to visit them and promised to return one more time before leaving the country. He was accompanied by that unknown man, who was himself Brazilian. The friend said he was very quiet and almost unfriendly toward them. This is the last time anyone can verify him being alive. Nobody we've spoken to knows the identity of the man who went with him. It was suggested he was along to serve as a guide and interpreter, but most of his co-workers asserted that Raphael spoke Portuguese and a couple of native languages as well, not to mention he knew his way around much of the country. What places he wasn't aware of, he wouldn't have had any problem finding willing locals to assist him. He was well known and liked, especially among many in the native community. And that's about the extent of what we know for sure happened. We're grateful to the authorities here and in Brazil for all the effort they put forward to bring Raphael home to us. That said, I can't say I'm happy with the result. To date, very little is known about how he lost his life. Cause of death is ruled as undetermined. My only hope is the unknown Brazilian man will soon be identified, and he can fill in all the empty spots that currently exist. I'm afraid to say that until then, we're left with far more questions than answers. I want to thank everyone who helped us in our search and provided the information needed to discover his body. Should any updates arise, we'll be sure to share them with you. I've discussed this with my wife, and we thought it may be good for me to finally tell my story. It would at the very least allow our children to know why their grandfather passed away. I hope you understand why this process has been so difficult for me once you fully hear the story. Now, with all that said, what follows is my memory of what happened this day. My dad was a quiet, serious, and no-nonsense sort of man. If he didn't want to do something, nobody could make him do it, even if it was to keep you safe. Seatbelts were his #1 pet peeve. He hated them and refused to wear them, even though they were required. He'd been ticketed several times, but he continued to refuse. Mom even showed him statistics proving they kept you safe, but it all fell on deaf ears. He was uncompromising and set in his ways. This trait would end up being what killed him in the end. The accident would occur on July 23, 1995. At the time, I was 12 years old. My family had taken a short camping trip to a lake on the Texas-Oklahoma border. It was the first and only vacation we were going to have that year. The entire weekend had been one endless mess. It was miserably hot, and my sister even got a severe sunburn. We had all been devoured by bugs as well. I know I couldn't stop scratching for weeks after. That morning, we were driving back through Oklahoma. Everyone seemed to be driving ridiculously slow and dangerously, and that was driving my dad crazy. He desperately wanted to get back home before dark. To add to the stress of the situation, I was picking on my sister and slapping her sunburned shoulders, making her scream like a banshee. Mom was doing her best to keep us in check. It made Dad even crazier than he already was. At some point, about halfway across the state, we slipped in behind a truck. It was going fast enough, but the bed was stacked high with all types of junk. My dad paid it no concern. He was just happy to be finally going the speed limit, although knowing him, we were probably going over it. The environment in the car was relaxed. I was listening to Metallica on my headphones, and everyone else was just sitting quietly. My dad had the radio turned down. Suddenly, something flew out of the bed of the truck into our path. I looked up, only to see Dad swerving out of control. He regained it just in time for a second collision. We slammed into the back of the truck doing 50 at least. Rather than pull over though, the truck stopped right there in the middle of the highway. The next thing I remember was waking up in a lot of pain. My seatbelt had stopped me, but it did nothing to stop all the objects flying into our car. My sister had been struck and was also hurt. Our mom was fussing over us, trying to make sure we were okay. No one was gravely injured at least no one but my dad. Mom looked over, an expression of horror on her face. She was sobbing and rubbing my dad's arms, and that was when I knew he was gone. I had to look even if I didn't want to. I slowly unlocked my belt and leaned forward. His upper body was collapsed into the steering wheel, his head turned facing my mom, blood covering everywhere. I could tell he never saw it coming. It's the only comfort I carry with me until this day. Of course, the stubborn jerk wasn't wearing his seatbelt. From then on, it's all a blur really. Emergency services arrived and took us all to the hospital. The driver of the truck was fine, all but for a sore neck. Family from Kansas City arrived later that evening, and we returned home the following day. As it always must, life for us carried on. Mom kept the family afloat until my sister and I went off to college, and she would eventually remarry a really good guy named Larry. Since I've become a father, my primary goal is to set a good example for my children. I love my dad, but he was a selfish man. If you have kids, be mindful of your own safety. It's your duty to be there to guide them into adulthood, and if you're gone, you can't do that. But that's just my 2 cents. Thank you all who took the time to hear this, and I hoped it helped you as much as it helped me. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I wanted badly to be an Olympic athlete when I grew up. It's important to know that I'm female to fully understand the context behind this story. I was fortunate that my school had the means to train me and the equipment that I needed to use in order to get stronger. During the school year, I would be able to work out and get good training with no trouble at all. The summertime was a different story, however. My family lived way out of town, you see. The school didn't even have a bus service that went out that far during that time. My mom would always drive me to school before she went off to work because of this, and she would pick me up afterward as well. I didn't have this option during the summertime, however. I mean, my mom still worked during the summer, but the school wasn't open, so I couldn't take advantage of the facilities. During the summer, I would always go out on long jogs in the country. The roads were dirt roads, not gravel, so they were pretty easy to run along. The only problems were that we had some pretty hot summers even back then, so I had to be careful not to overheat myself while I was exercising. I would very often exercise in the late evening when it was getting dark and cooler outside. Although it wasn't well lit, I knew the way, and often the moon would give me more than enough light to see. When I was about 17 years old, I had been doing these jogs for several summers at that point. I'll be honest that at this point, my likelihood of ever being an Olympic athlete was very small. I still insisted on staying in shape no matter what though. I did those jogs nearly every day I could. There weren't a lot of houses along the route that I jogged and back. However, of the few there was one I always assumed was abandoned. I'd never seen any people there. We never saw anyone around. Hell, even some of the windows were boarded up. There were no trespassing signs all over the place. I'll admit that the signs didn't mean much though, since they were everywhere in that area, even places that were known to be abandoned. The house just had that sort of vibe to it too. It looked like it hadn't been kept up very well, and was probably a local hangout for ghosts. I was out jogging that summer in the evening. It was still light enough outside to see things clearly, even though the sun was already setting. When I ran by that house, which I normally didn't pay much attention to, something caught my eye this time, and I looked over in surprise. There was a man sitting on the porch in a chair. Looked like he was smoking or something. I wondered why anyone would have liked to have moved into a house like that. Normally, when I jog by a house and see someone out on the porch, I would give them a friendly wave as I passed by. Either that, or they would wave to me first. I was so surprised to see someone at that house, though, I didn't even think to give a greeting. I just jogged on, lost in my thoughts about what was going on. The next few days that I was out jogging, I didn't see the man sitting on the porch again. However, not seeing him there made the jogs a lot less comfortable for some reason. I mean, I don't know why, but I began getting a real uneasy feeling every time I passed by that house, both on my jog out and my jog in. I told myself that the feeling was only because of the fact I had seen someone at that supposedly abandoned area, but regardless of the reasoning though, I felt uneasy every time I jogged right by that house. It might have been about a week or so after that, when I was doing my nightly jog once again, when I noticed something else. I saw the person sitting on the porch again, although this time he also saw me. He got up and walked back into his house. I got to the point in my jog when I was turning around to go back home. It was dark at that point, and although the moon was full, it was still a little scary. I don't know exactly why, but I began getting an uneasy feeling the closer I had been getting back to that house. I mean, we all get those sorts of feelings from time to time, where you just can't shake it no matter what you do. So you know how I must feel as I jogged on by. I was listening to my Walkman as I did every time I went for a jog. That's one thing you could say about a lot of 80s music. It was at least good to exercise to. It kept me going, and thankfully the music helped me relax a little as I ran by that house. I passed by it feeling a little nervous, but when nothing happened, I felt a whole lot better. I still had a little ways to go before I got home though. I did feel like I was able to relax a bit more. As I was running, the strangest thing happened. It felt like something touched me from behind, as if someone were jogging right behind me. It was a light touch, but it still surprised me. Only slowing down slightly, I peeked over my left shoulder, horrified to see the man from the house running right next to me. There was enough light for me to know that it was him without a shadow of a doubt, and it appeared he was chasing me. That was when I realized that must have been the man trying to grab me. Perhaps I was too fast for him to catch up in that moment. That was all I could think of. For the split second that I saw the look on his face, though, he looked crazed and insane, almost evil. I was truly scared for my life. I did the only thing I could do. I put it into high gear and took off as quickly as I could. I was jogging previously, but now I put everything into my running and did my best to run fast. The first few times I checked back over my shoulder, the guy was still clearly in pursuit of me. However, as it continued, it was obvious he was not in the same condition I was, and he was quickly falling behind. There was no doubt he was still trying, though. I ran as fast as I could and stopped looking back after the first few times. I just wanted to get home, knowing my dad was there and would absolutely protect me from this creep. I ran to my driveway. I ran up to the door and opened it. The moment I stopped to open the door, I expected to be grabbed and pulled away, but that didn't happen. I rushed inside, locked the door behind me, and looked out the 3 rectangular windows on it, trying to see if anyone was out there. The man was there, but he was now standing at the end of the driveway. He didn't try to approach. My mom and dad were obviously concerned with how I'd run into the house like I did. I turned and looked to them and explained what happened. I then turned and looked out the window, only to see the man was not there anymore. I knew it was that guy from the house, and I made sure my father knew that too. My dad grabbed his gun and went out there to confront the guy. My dad was a huge old country boy who anyone in their right minds would have been scared of. He jumped in his truck and went to the guy's house. My mom didn't call the police. She was worried my dad would be the one to get into trouble. We simply waited for him to get back. It took a while for my dad to arrive, and it was a bit nerve-wracking waiting for it. When he did arrive back, we both hoped he would have gotten hold of the guy, but that didn't happen. He didn't find anyone alongside the road, nor was there anyone at the house. He even broke down the door to check inside, but he didn't find anyone there. We did some checking, and it turned out the house didn't even have a tenant. The property was owned by the owner of the town's grocery store, and no one was supposed to be living there. They figured some homeless guy took up residence there for a while, or perhaps an ex-con who had nowhere else to go or something. I don't know exactly, but whoever it was, I'm lucky I was in the shape to outrun them. I grew up in a very rural area. My family was pretty poor, and we didn't normally have much to do to entertain ourselves. We did have guns though, and so did my best friend Tom at the time. Occasionally, as teenagers, we'd go out spotlighting. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's when you go hunting at night. You take a light with you and shine it into the woods. You'll get to see the light shine off the eyes of an animal. Then you would try to shoot the animal if you could. It was an extremely dangerous method of hunting, and illegal in most places. Obviously, it was way too easy to accidentally shoot someone else who happened to be out there. My family relied strongly on hunting in order to eat. At the time, as a kid though, I didn't really understand that, and just did it because I enjoyed doing it. As an adult, I don't really like to hunt as I once did, but anything I might have shot, I definitely would have brought it back home with me. Tom and I had gotten pretty deep into the woods, and were having no luck finding anything. We never had too much luck hunting anyway. We weren't exactly good at being quiet when we went out there. Plus, I always wondered if shining lights all over the place didn't scare off all the animals so you couldn't get anything. Honestly though, we were just bored and looking for something to do. We didn't know if we were actually going to get anything anyway. After a while, the light disappeared though, and Tom grabbed me from behind. I jumped in surprise. I was about to admonish him because I had the gun with me, and he had the flashlight. I was about to tell him he definitely didn't want to be shot. He immediately told me to be quiet though. "There's a huge guy out there," he said in a whisper. "I only saw him from behind, so I turned out the light. He might not know we're here yet." I was confused as to why he seemed so cautious. I had a rifle on me, obviously, and I wasn't scared of some random person out in the woods. We literally had a gun. Something that would turn any horror situation around in a minute. We could sort of see each other in the dark, as my eyes were adjusting to the light being off. I really wanted him to turn it back on, but he seemed too scared to actually do it. Finally, I simply grabbed the light from him. I turned it on, and shined it over in the direction he indicated he had seen the man. I began walking over to that area, rifle in one hand and flashlight in the other. Tom was still scared, obviously, but he followed me because he didn't want to be alone. No matter where I looked, I couldn't find anyone out in the woods with us. I kept shining the light all around, which made him even more nervous. He thought it would draw attention to us. I finally decided he was probably just trying to scare me. I told him he'd had his fun, and we should start heading back toward my house now. We didn't get very far until we both did see a person. However, this person was laying on the ground in front of a tree. As we got closer, we realized the person was not breathing, and their back was completely soaked in blood. That was when the fear suddenly hit me. I didn't even think about checking for a pulse or anything. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Tom and I started heading out of the forest and back toward my house. It took us a while to get there. We called the police when we got home. The police found the body soon after. They were definitely dead, been stabbed several times in the back. They questioned both of us, but I told them Tom had been the only one to see the guy going through the woods. I had no way to describe the person to them. Our experience made living in that area really crazy. It also created a lot of buzz around Tom and I, which wasn't exactly comfortable. I mean, if the murderer happened to read the newspaper, he would know we were out there that night. That made simply going to sleep a scary thing, and we stayed out of the woods for a long time after. No one was ever charged with the crime. I'm sure of that, because neither Tom or I were ever contacted about having to identify anyone. Not that I could have anyway, but as far as I'm aware, that's a murder left unsolved to this day. I have never gone hunting in my lifetime, and I don't really ever plan on doing it either. I have nothing against people who do, I just know it's not for me. That being said, if I don't know the terminology that hunters use for things, I apologize. When I was about 13 years old, my parents bought a really large rural property. Other than the area that we had our house on, it included acres and acres of woods that surrounded the house. It didn't take long until after we moved in that I began happily exploring this area. I would end up spending a whole lot of time out there too, letting my imagination run wild. Since there weren't any houses anywhere close to us, I would always be out doing this by myself. There were no other kids for miles around. Within the first couple of months of us living in that house, I found something that really interested me. I noticed this platform up in a tree. It had a trap door in it and a retractable rope ladder that hung down from it. I found the whole thing pretty fascinating. I was able to get the ladder down and climbed up through the trap door onto the platform. I found I could see quite a bit of the woods from up there, and I liked it quite a lot. When I told my dad about this find, he told me it was something often used by hunters. They would hang out on the platform for hours and hours, waiting for deer or something else to shoot to come along. He explained to me why a deer hunter needed to be hanging out up in a tree, but I have to admit I didn't really remember much of that explanation. The fact was, the platform was sturdy, so I had a place in the woods I could camp out every now and then. I figured it would be better than sleeping on the ground at least. When I was 15, I had spent plenty of time over the previous 2 years hanging out on that platform. I would go and sometimes even camp out on it in the middle of summer. Throughout the whole time, I'd never had anything strange happen. That makes what eventually did happen all that scarier. It was a summer day, and I decided to spend the night out on the platform. I got myself my flashlight, my comic books, my sleeping bag, some food and drink, and some other things to go for the night. I let my parents know where I was going and that I would be back home in the following morning. I was in a pretty good mood that day, as I recall. I was looking forward to what should be a really good night. Well, I'll fast forward past all the normal stuff about going out and setting up. I'll get straight into what happened during the night. It was dark out, and I'd been up on the platform for quite a while. I had 2 sources of light, a regular flashlight and a book light. This was years and years before mobile phones were such a common thing, so I didn't have anything like that to light the way. Only having the barest amount of light didn't really bother me though. I wasn't afraid of the dark. There wasn't any wildlife I needed to be afraid of up there in that tree either. None of it was a big deal for me. It had been dark for quite a while when I heard it for the first time. It sounded like footfalls. At first, I perked up just a little. My first thought was there might be a deer or something nearby. I'd experienced them in the area several times when I was out in the woods. I listened for a while. I'd been reading a book at the time, so now I switched my light off. As I listened, I kept hearing the footfalls around the area. I wanted to flash my light out there to get a look at whatever it was, but I also didn't want to scare an animal if it indeed was what it was. I just kept on listening to the sounds of these footfalls, wondering how many deer might be out there at the moment. For a while, I heard them walking around. There was no pattern or anything as far as I could tell. I enjoyed listening to it until I heard something that was quite unexpected. It sounded like someone tripping over something and suddenly saying, "Shit!" It was only then I realized I was hearing a person walking around, not a deer. My immediate thought was panic. This was private property, which my father owned, and no one was supposed to be on. I worried that anyone who was out there might be up to no good because of this. My first thought was to shine my flashlight to see who it was, but I soon decided that was a bad idea. If they were trespassing on my dad's property, they were already breaking one law. Who's to say what they were doing out there, and that they weren't willing to break another too? I heard some talking, but I couldn't tell what was being said at first. I listened, trying to be as quiet as possible. The more I tried to listen, though, the more I realized I couldn't make sense of what was being discussed. Although I'd heard the cussing quite clearly, the rest of what they were saying sounded like gibberish. I don't mean like another common language or something either. I mean the nonsense you hear when someone is supposedly speaking in tongues. I'd heard people do this before, and it definitely reminded me a lot of that. I tried not to make a sound. I was really worried at that point. I mean, I wanted to get down off that platform and run for home, but that wouldn't have been the best idea. I would have to open the trapdoor and lower the ladder in order to do it. Although I was in a prime position if I was a hunter, I was in a pretty bad position if I were to end up hunted. I wouldn't have the time to get down the tree before they noticed me. The voices got closer and louder as they did. Still, I couldn't understand a word they were speaking, just more of that weird-sounding gibberish. Soon, they were standing right underneath the platform, by the trunk of the tree I was hiding in. I could hear them talking right under me. I had never in my life tried to be more silent than I had in that moment. I was scared that in my trying to be quiet, I was going to end up making a noise that would give me away. I was as conscious of the sound of my breathing as I was of the strange speaking by the person. It seemed like they were underneath forever. I kept waiting for them to find out the platform was in the tree and get up on it. It was the freakiest moment of my entire life. Finally, I heard them begin to walk away. I wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, but I also didn't want to make any noise. I wanted to get out of the tree and go home, but I couldn't do that either. I did the only thing I could, remained up on the platform, trying to be as quiet as possible. Despite the nervousness and the fear, I eventually did fall asleep. I woke up in the morning with a shock, mad at myself for having done so. Immediately, I got down from the tree and made my way home in the safety of the sunlight. Although that wasn't the last time I went out to the platform, it was the last time I ever spent the night on it. I think my parents thought I was making the story up. I told them once I had seen a ghost, and they thought I was making that up too, so they didn't seem to believe me. Whatever that person was out that night, whether a weird person or a weird something else, I definitely heard them, and I'm glad I haven't ever again. The single worst day of my life started in the unlikeliest of ways when I took a trip to visit my grandpa near Omaha, Nebraska. The first problem I ran into was the lack of cell signal out there in the sticks. No internet meant my GPS started going haywire, and I'd never been great at reading physical maps. That, and there were basically no road signs anywhere. The ones that were there were in such bad shape you could barely read them, even if you slowed down heavily when passing by. In the end, I had to actually stop by some random guy's house to ask for directions. The fact that even he didn't seem to know what I was talking about didn't really fill me with much confidence. He did mention of knowing of an old house off a dirt road, maybe a mile or two away from his own. He said it wouldn't be the easiest to find, but he was basically 75% sure it was close to the area I was talking about. I went off and headed in the direction he'd pointed out, hoping to make it to my grandpa's before lunchtime. A few minutes later, I spotted a dirt road turnoff that I thought might be the one the man had been talking about. After driving down it for a few minutes, though, I didn't see any houses or any kind of civilization. I figured I must have made a wrong turn. Not surprising, considering how crappy the infrastructure was, but it was pretty frustrating. Then, luckily, I saw a driveway out of nowhere. I started to get my hopes up, thinking this must be my grandpa's place. It clearly wasn't, though. There were a bunch of men with a van and a car, all stood around talking. My grandpa wasn't exactly one for company, but I figured at least I could ask them for some more directions. That's exactly what I went to do, but the second I turned into their driveway, I noticed the men standing around started to act a little anxious. One guy immediately tore away from the circle they had going. Another looked around, as though he was expecting other people to show up or something. I realized I must have just interrupted something very private. I didn't fully realize the danger I'd just driven into, though. Right as I stopped the car, I heard one of the guys yell something to another. Then I took my eyes off them for a second as I reached for the road map I had. When I looked up again, all I could see was a gun pointing at me through my driver's side window. I realized now in the few seconds that followed that I was just waiting for the guy to pull the trigger. I can't remember anything other than gun, but I didn't move. I just froze there, didn't try to back out or duck or anything. I just sort of waited for everything to turn black, like on a nature documentary when a deer gets caught by a tiger or something. They just sort of go limp as they're thinking, well, I guess this is it. Seconds later, the guy with the gun said, "Turn off the engine." Then, when I did, he followed up with, "Get out of the car." I did as he said, feeling my knees wobble a little as I stepped onto the dirt outside. I didn't think I could get any more scared, but I was wrong, because when another guy spoke next, I felt like I honestly could have made an actual mess in my shorts. "It's a cop, man. Just shoot him and let's get out of here." That suddenly roused me from being all frozen and silent in fear. I just started saying, "I'm not a cop, I swear to God. I'm just looking for my grandpa's place." It all came out in one long frenzied sentence, and I can't really write everything I said into this. I was stammering though, and my voice was shaking. I was just a mess. The same guy who'd talked before piped up again. "He's lying, man. Just kill him. We can't lose this shipment." And that was the only clue I had as to what was going down in that meeting. I've agreed with a few other people's suggestions that it was drug-related. I didn't know this at the time, but Douglas County, the county that Omaha is in, has a huge meth problem, probably the biggest in the entire country. As myself and many others suspect, I probably stumbled across some sort of meth deal. Probably a pretty big one too, considering some of the hardware that was on display. Not only did I have some kind of gun in my face the whole time, but the other guys emerged with guns I'd only ever seen in Call of Duty. I'm talking the kinds with all sorts of attachments and stuff on them. Like I said, there was a hot minute there where I really did think I was about to die. Then I heard a guy with a pistol trained on me say, "Get the tape." I started to think that they might have something even worse in mind for me. What's weird though is that even though that didn't mean they were going to kill me, my survival instincts told me to at least buy a little more time. Thinking about it now, letting them tie me up like they did could have easily secured my death, not helped me avoid it. But still, I just let them do what they did in hopes that compliance might lead to mercy. They put tape over my eyes as well as around my wrists and ankles. They made me kneel in the dirt as they frisked me. I'm pretty sure they searched my car too. I mean it when I said they had some serious hardware, because I'm assuming you need something pretty advanced to make sure there's no secret recording equipment on a car. One of the guys said, "Car's clean," at one point. That made me realize these guys weren't just your average crackheads. I piped up again that I was not a cop, and that they could search me all they liked, but they wouldn't find a badge or a gun or anything like that. That didn't seem to satisfy them, though. They kept arguing amongst themselves about what to do with me. They took out my license at one point, because I could hear them passing it around and asking each other, "You know this guy? You recognize him?" Stuff like that. I can't even describe how relieved I was when I heard them all agree they'd never seen me before, and that I probably really wasn't any kind of undercover cop or something. I was praying that meant they wouldn't kill me, but at the same time I knew I was still in quite a bit of trouble. Not long after that, they decided what they were going to do with me. The guy who'd been suggesting they kill me kept on making that suggestion. Then, the guy who'd ordered me tied up told him to shut the fuck up, saying killing me was a bad idea. During these few moments of pure terror, he was like my best friend in the world. If it had been the bloodthirsty one in charge, I definitely wouldn't be around to write this. Then, right as it seemed I was going to get away unharmed, the boss of the group seemed to have a sudden change of heart. I started wailing about how I'd never snitch, how I'd just drive off and forget everything I saw. I'd caused them no trouble whatsoever, but that didn't seem to do the trick. When I heard the boss doing something with his gun, I begged him over and over not to kill me. I tried everything, reminding him it would be too much trouble, that I was sorry for interrupting them, that I didn't see anything, but not a word came out of my mouth that seemed to change his mind. I hadn't even finished talking when I felt him press the gun to the back of my head, and I felt myself starting to cry under the tape they'd wrapped around my eyes. I wished I'd never gotten out of bed that morning. The last thing I heard him say before he pulled the trigger was "Start digging a hole." Every muscle in my body seemed to tense up in preparation for oblivion. I heard the trigger pull with a dull click that seemed to echo around my skull. Then there was nothing, though. No bang, no pain, no blood and brains. I wasn't falling forward or backward or wherever. I was still just kneeling there, tensed up, feeling pee trickle down my thigh. They all started laughing at me, laughing at how I'd begged and pleaded with them not to kill me. It was just some cruel prank to instill the fear of God into me. Let me tell you, it worked. I felt the hot breath of the boss on the back of my neck. "I'm keeping your license. If anything happens, I'm sending someone to pay you a visit. Think of it as an insurance policy." I was later told this was called dry firing, or something like that. After that, they tossed me in the backseat of a car, and from the very short distance I was moved, I figured I was back on my own. Not long after, I heard engines gunning, then moving vehicles, then silence. They left me there in the back of my car, tied up and blindfolded, for what felt like days. In reality, it was around 24 hours. If a passing farmer using the back roads hadn't spotted me, there's a real chance I might have died of dehydration. My phone had upwards of 50 missed calls. I had been reported missing by my parents. It was a whole ordeal, and obviously a big part of what followed was being questioned by police. I didn't ask to talk to them, but considering how I was found, it was a sure thing. I just stonewalled the deputy, who showed up and told my parents why I had refused to say a word about what happened. That was honestly the worst part. Having my own life threatened and being subjected to what amounted to a mock execution was one thing, but having my own mom and dad realize they were no longer safe in their own home was another thing entirely. We moved shortly after that, living with family in Des Moines for a few weeks. After, we could find an apartment, which my mom and dad then used as a base to sell their house. Every so often, the cruel, maddening chaos of it all hits me at once. Our entire lives were uprooted, all because of one wrong turn I made on a dirt road. A few years back, I was out elk hunting with my brother up in Alberta, Canada. That morning, my hunting buddy Paul and I were headed out to hunt near the Simonette River. I only had my rifle with me, since Rob didn't have a big game license at the time. As some of you might know, that area is considered bear country, and since one half of a hunting party was very vulnerable without a firearm, we hit up the nearest ranger station and asked about any bear sightings. The ranger was very helpful, and warned us there was definitely a grizzly in the area. They had been tracking sightings for weeks though, and the ranger told us that if we stuck to certain trails and avoided others, we should be able to stay out of the bear's territory, which would lower our chances of encountering it greatly. That might seem silly to people who understand how vast a bear's territory can be, but up here, we believe that mitigation can be just as effective as outright protection. Anyway, we'd been walking for an hour or so. Because there was a fresh blanket of snow on the ground, it was much harder to recognize where each trail turned. At one point, we both realized we must have taken a wrong turn a mile or so back, because we could no longer recognize where we were. We decided to make our way back to the truck, so we could orient ourselves once again. That was when we suddenly noticed fresh wolf tracks in the snow. Wolves generally aren't as dangerous as bears. They're way too smart to attack humans. It still meant we got a little tense though, as we carried on padding through the snow in dead silence. Moments later, we caught a glimpse of an animal carcass laying there in the snow. It was barely touched, with no other scavengers nearby. This was a huge red flag to us, as crows tend to descend on anything that doesn't have an apex predator nearby. We both started to worry we were about to encounter something we really didn't want to. I loaded my rifle as we slowly approached, thinking we might be in for a close encounter with a wolf or a wolf pack who would be wanting to defend this carcass, obviously. As we both scanned the area, extremely on edge by that point, I heard this low, calling sound. This huge tree seemed to be blocking my view of where it was coming from, so I couldn't see what was making it in that moment. That's when Paul suddenly let out a terrified, high-pitched cry. "It's a grizzly!" Then, the next second, all I could see was a huge bear charging right at him. If you haven't seen how fast a bear can charge, it's hard to imagine how a lumbering beast can achieve such frightening speeds. I can assure you, though, when they want to, those things can fly at you like a cannonball. It was truly terrifying to behold. The bear moved so fast I barely had time to react, and definitely not enough time to raise my rifle to aim. Still though, I had to get a shot off, even if just to scare it. I tried my best to aim from the hip and hit the bear in the head. I fired and nothing. The shot hit, but the bear didn't even so much as flinch. Luckily, Paul was able to take cover behind two trees that were pretty close together, so they kind of acted like a palisade between him and the bear. The grizzly took a few swipes at him, missed, then kept moving around the tree before turning in my direction. I don't think I can even really describe the kind of terror I felt in that moment. It's like nothing I've felt before, since humanity, spend so much time dreaming up imaginary monsters for books or movies, when there are real-life monsters walking the earth alongside us. And here on this day, I found one charging straight at me. It must have been no more than 8 meters away from me when I reloaded my rifle's bullet and fired again. That time, I actually saw a spray of blood in the air from where the bullet tore through its shoulder, but to my horror, it didn't seem to flinch that time either. I had to fall back onto my butt and barely dodged a swipe it took at me. I just kept on crawling backward through the snow. I couldn't get the leverage to reload my rifle again. It took another swipe at me. I knew then that I must have put the bullet through an important part of its shoulder though, because the force surely wasn't as powerful as I thought it would be. I saw drops of blood splashing on the snow in front of me. It probably realized then that its arm was hurt, so that's when it opened its mouth to bite me, lunging forward as I lay there in the snow. I didn't really plan on it, but what I did next was pure instinct. I just grabbed my gun's barrel and shoved it towards its mouth to keep it from biting me. I watched the entire thing disappear down its throat. It actually bit down on it, and I swear I heard one of its teeth shatter as it chewed on the steel. For a few seconds, it pushed the rifle butt down into my neck, and that gave me the leverage I needed to actually work the bolt again to put another round in the chamber. Seconds later, I pulled the trigger again. It sent the bullet either through its brain or through its spine, because it just went limp and rolled onto its side in the snow. The whole event lasted no more than maybe 20 or 30 seconds, but it was the most terrified I'd ever been in my entire life. As scary as it had been, though, the aftermath was probably worse. You'd think that after surviving something like that, you'd be all like, "Man, screw those bears." But I just felt a sickening regret. Grizzlies are beautiful animals, and if there were another way, I would have wanted it to live. I just didn't have that option, though. In that moment, it was either it or me. There was no negotiating or communicating with it, and I think that's what scares me most about nature of all. Humanity's most powerful tool is our ability to communicate, but out there in nature, it's useless against other animals. If Mother Nature wants you dead, there's no stopping it. Either you die or it dies, and there's no in between. Back in the 1950s, my grandpa used to sell vacuum cleaners door to door all over the country. He was one of the last great American traveling salesmen, the kind Arthur Miller wrote about, but with considerably less family trauma. He used to say how he'd had his fair share of close encounters with bad folks, as he called them, but he also had this one story that really stuck with me, for obvious reasons. So he's down in Florida when he runs into a friend of his out on the road, a guy who sold steam irons. The guy told him that he'd just visited a place where the owner already owned a steam iron, but he was in the market for a vacuum cleaner. This was way back when Walmarts didn't exist yet, and getting a hold of items like that was way tougher than it is now. Plus, this guy was an old-timer who didn't get out all that much anyway. He gave my grandpa the hint. My grandpa thanked him, then headed out to look for the property. He was following the guy's directions to the letter. He'd even gotten a description of the guy's house too, so when he turned down some old dirt road and the house looked nothing like the one that was described, he figured he'd probably made a wrong turn. Lo and behold, when he went to check, the number was different on the mailbox. A completely different address, but given how he was already there, he figured he might as well try to sell something anyhow. As he was walking up to the guy's door, he saw a real-life alligator statue thing on the guy's front porch. As he got closer, he realized it had to be stuffed or something. It was super realistic. He got within about 3 feet of the guy's door. He'd had his eyes glued on this creepy realistic alligator when out of nowhere, the statue blinked. My grandpa said he froze. Then, right as he did, the gator turned its head and lunged toward him. He turned around and bolted back to his car. The whole way he could hear the gator chasing after him. When he got to his car door and turned around, it was right there trying to take a bite out of his ankles. He said he'd never been so scared in all his life. This guy had a freaking guard gator. Not a guard dog, a guard gator. My grandpa gunned his car engine and got out of there. He decided to skip the sales that day. A few years ago, I had this really erratic schedule where I had to get up super early for school before going to my part-time job until around 10 or 11 at night. I think there was about 3 months there where I didn't get any more than 5 hours of sleep a night. After a while, it started to have a really terrible effect on me. I found my memory started to become shot, my mood was seriously affected, and life in general just got really, really tough. I started making a lot of basic mistakes on a daily basis, and while some were just irritating, one almost cost me my life. It was when I was driving home one night, and although I made the same journey 100 times before, my overtired brain was at a breaking point, and I made a wrong turn. I know what you're thinking. That's just a minor inconvenience. I could have just turned around and corrected my course immediately, but this wrong turn was down a one-way street, and as fate would have it, some motocross-mounted joyrider was coming the other way, doing 40 to 50 miles per hour. There wasn't a thing I could do about it. This kid had no helmet on either, so the second he impacted me, his head smashed right through his windshield, his body stopping only as his shoulders hit the crunched-up glass. It was the most horrific sight I've ever seen in my entire life. The kid's head had completely split open, splashing blood all over me. There was no way he could possibly be alive. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then, as my screams died down, I could hear him groaning, with all these gurgles coming from where blood or something was caught in his throat. I heard those sounds in my nightmares for months afterwards. The kid died on his way to the hospital, unfortunately. I thought I was going to go to prison over it. I mean, I honestly believe I deserved to go to jail for a long time. It took a lot for people to talk me down and tell me that the kid was ripping it down this street on a stolen bike wearing no helmet going the wrong way, and if he hadn't made that choice, he'd still be alive. I made one dumb mistake, but the kid had made a fatal criminal one. I can't really justify that to myself, though. Even though the state didn't try to prosecute me, his mom tried to make a civil suit to get some money off me. I tried to offer her enough to cover the kid's funeral, but she wanted more. She wanted to see me in court. The whole civil suit thing was thrown out because of the whole Grand Theft Auto thing, though. I understand where she was coming from. She didn't want it to be nice and respectful or like charity. She wanted to take something from me because I'd taken something from her. I still go to therapy over the whole thing, and sometimes I see that kid's face in my dreams. The way his eyes were bulging out of his head with his head split open, somehow still alive, groaning and gurgling his final breaths away. All because I went down the wrong street. My name is Dot. I'm 22 years old and I'm from North Dakota. I have a lot of tattoos as well. I got my first when I was 17 actually. Shout out to the tattoo artist who knew the idea was not mine, but still inked me up anyway. After that, I was pretty much hooked. I got a sleeve over the course of about 9 months during my late teens. Got my neck covered with a skull and flower motif. I got a wolf covering pretty much my entire right thigh. I even got a small face tattoo. Provocative, I know, but in for a penny, in for a pound, as they say. I know some people look at me and think I'm some kind of trashy meth head loser or something, but once you get to know me, I'm nothing like that. I'm a thoughtful person whose ink has no bearing on their actual personality. I'm also a great babysitter. I love to take care of kids, and all the families whose kids I took care of learned that for themselves by taking a chance with me. Maybe that makes me sound kind of full of myself, but I hope it doesn't. I'd like to think it's fully justified, given some of the cruel things that have happened to me because of my tattoos over the years. And that also brings me to my next point. I'm not gonna say I'm the prettiest girl in the world or anything, but for some reason my tattoos seem to elicit a certain kind of effect from some people. I don't want to go into too much about those with detail. I'm sure you can guess if you apply a little imagination. I really hate some of the comments people make when they see my ink though. At best, it's just annoying, and people get the message when I tell them to stick their non-compliments where the sun don't shine. At worst though, men can get very frightening when they're not used to being told no, and this story involves one of those cases. In May of 2019, I was on my way to one of my regular babysitting jobs on a humid Friday night. I needed to stop up quickly at a gas station to top up my tank. I live in a quite rural area, and despite this gas station being a pretty regular stop for me, it was the only one for miles and miles around. Because of this, while it certainly had a fair share of regulars, it also got plenty of visitors who weren't from the area. Sometimes not even from the Rough Rider country at all. They're all just passing through. I'm guessing this particular guy was passing through as well. I'd never seen him before, and he was wearing some sort of sports team cap. I don't know if it was because I was hungry or just in a grouchy mood, but when he started making comments my way, I gave him the business, and particularly harshly as well. I told him I was probably his daughter's age, assuming anyone let him have one, and asked how he'd like it if some guy started talking to his girl the way he was talking to me. He then made some comment about how he'd never let his daughter, guessing he did have one because of this, quote-unquote, ruin her body the way I had. And comments like that used to hurt me a lot. Not anymore so often, but back then at the time, I told him to go jump in a lake. A nicer version of what I actually said. But I don't want to get anyone in trouble if they're repeating this story. I paid for my gas and drove off after. I didn't think I was being followed. But then again, I don't think I looked in my rear view the whole drive there. Like I said, I live in a pretty rural area, and unless you pass through a small town or whatever, there's not much need to actually check your rear view while you're out on the main highways. When I got to the place I was babysitting at, I had no idea of what was about to befall me that night. Not a single clue. So it was with blissful ignorance that I parked my car, knocked on the door, and went inside to chat with the mom and say hi to the little man. A few hours went by, and I mostly occupied myself by playing Nintendo Switch with the little guy, and deliberately losing to make him feel good about himself. You know how that sort of thing tends to go. Not that I'm any good anyway. Sometimes I didn't even have to pretend to lose, but it brought me a lot of joy to see him so happy about winning. Anyway, at about 9 p.m., which was way later than his regular bedtime, but I let him stay past a little bit, I took the little guy to bed and read him a story until he was soundly snoozing. After that, I helped myself to some of the leftovers that the mom had left for me. I settled into the couch to watch some TV and talk to my friends, when right about then I heard a knock at the door. I got up to see who was there, kind of nervous about who it would be at this time of night. I still didn't want to just ignore it though, just in case it was something important. When I looked out to check, there was no one there. Kids play pranks sometimes, right? Even though it's a rural area where the houses are sometimes half a mile apart, it could have easily been a bunch of kids who cycled over just to get up to no good. That's what I told myself anyway. I'm not the type to freak out over a game of ding-dong ditch, so I just closed the door and muttered something about dumb kids under my breath, then went back to watching TV. Not long after that, though, it happened again, only the knocking on the door was even louder this time, and kind of interspersed too, almost like someone was kicking the door or something. I got really mad, thinking they were going to wake the little guy upstairs, in which case it would be super difficult to get him back to sleep. That time I opened the door, took a few steps outside, and looked around to see if anyone was watching or hiding in the darkness. There was no one in sight, but I definitely wanted whoever was doing this to stop doing it. In a voice I tried to keep low enough to not wake the kid upstairs, but loud enough for anyone close by to hear, I told whoever it was that if they did that again, I'd be calling the cops soon after. In the moments after I spoke, nothing moved and nothing stirred either. There was just this dead silence in the air, which actually started to give me a bit of the creeps. After a while, it was quite obvious that whoever had done this was still quite close by. I didn't hear any shuffling around or voices or anything like that, but I could tell someone was there watching me. Feeling pretty exposed, I turned around to walk back inside the house. I can't even really describe the kind of terror I felt when I turned around and saw that sports cap staring me in the face. Even with all the lessons in writing I've had, I'm struggling to find the words to describe that sensation. All that cliche stuff like my blood ran cold or a shiver ran up my spine. And they sound like something out of a campfire story compared to what actual heart-pounding terror feels like. I felt my heart just thumping a mile a minute, and I felt this alarm bell feeling in my head. I was outside now, alone with this guy who'd followed me home from the gas station. Maybe the guy even thought this is where I lived. Next thing I knew, his big calloused hand flew up towards my throat, and I felt almost all my air being cut off. I started to make these scary wheezing noises just to get the air into my lungs. I remember how my hand shot up to his wrist, trying to pull his hand away from my throat, but he was way too strong for me to even budge it. I kicked out at him and tried to land it where it would hurt him the most, but my first and only effort landed on his thigh. After that, he held me out at arm's length, so I couldn't reach him. Every time I tried to kick him again, I not only missed completely, but he squeezed a little harder for a second so I couldn't breathe at all. In the end, I was basically just hanging there, feet only touching the ground because I was on my tiptoes. He started smiling at me. I don't want to repeat exactly what he said because it was so disgusting, but I remember every freaking word. To paraphrase, he basically said a girl like me should know better than to talk to a man like I had, and he'd take a great deal of pleasure in teaching me a lesson I should have learned years ago. He made some comment about how he'd had to wait quite a while to make sure I was home alone, but he was glad that he did, because now no one would be able to stop him. Like I said, I don't want to quote him fully, but he was extremely graphic about what he was going to do. I can barely describe the feelings that boiled up inside me, knowing he was about to do this right there to me in the driveway. Honestly, the only consolation was that I might not have to be awake for it, because breathing was so hard by that point, I was about to pass out. The guy then basically threw me onto the front lawn, which was slightly out of sight of the road outside thanks to this big hedge the family had been cultivating over the years. The entire North Dakota Highway Patrol could have driven by and I don't think they would have seen a thing. I was screwed in more ways than one. Right as the guy was standing over me, I heard a little voice bark out from the doorway of the house. It was the kid I was babysitting. The little man had somehow woken up during everything that was going on, heard the guy talking, and headed downstairs to see what was happening. I don't know what went through the guy's head after seeing the little kid watching what he was about to do. Like I said earlier, I'm almost certain he had kids of his own, but it was enough to make him think twice. He backed up a little and told me I was the luckiest little girl on the face of the earth, then started telling the kid I was babysitting that he was helping me up because I'd fallen down. The kid didn't buy it for a second though. I've always been amazed at how brave he was in that moment, as he once again let out an impossibly loud yell for how small he was. I was already scrambling back towards the house by the time the guy started walking out of the driveway. All I had going through my head was to get a 911 dispatcher to listen as I read out the guy's license plate. I didn't know where he was parked, but it had to be close by. All I needed to do was get my phone fast enough, and I'd be able to get this guy arrested. Sadly, I was not fast enough. By the time I rushed back out into the road outside, all we could see was a flash of the guy's rear lights in the distance before they faded into nothingness. I managed to tell the dispatcher as much as I could, including what he looked like in the stretch of highway I figured he might be driving down. But since I had no idea what type of car he was driving, I guess it wasn't enough for the cops to get him on a traffic stop or anything. After the call ended, I tried my best to protect the little guy from the horrifying truth of what just happened, but he was smart enough to know that a bad man had come to the house. For a few moments, the both of us had been in a terrifying amount of danger. He was still awake when his mom and dad got home, but they could instantly tell something bad had happened. Their only issue was that I hadn't called to tell them, but I just didn't want to ruin one of their rare date nights, given no one actually got hurt. I mean, I had one heck of a bruise around my throat the next day. But aside from that, everyone was pretty much unscathed. Now that I look back on it, I don't think the guy ever really had the intention of killing me or anything. If he was psycho enough to do something like that, I don't think he would have really cared if a kid was watching. I just think having a teen girl give him disrespect made him really angry. Maybe he was having just a bad enough day that he felt like taking some spite out on me or something. I don't know. Then again, I've always been inclined to see the best in people, and I'm still something of a perennial optimist, so maybe I'm wrong in that instinct. Back when I was a kid, I had this regular babysitter who was the daughter of one of my dad's coworkers. I kind of hated her at the time. She was terrible at her job. I had other babysitters who I actually liked, so I knew she was terrible. She seemed like she didn't want to be there at all. She was also super strict with me, overzealously carrying my parents' rules to the letter as a way of taking out her spite on me. I got used to doing things like having to call downstairs first if I even wanted to get a glass of water after bedtime, not even daring to turn on my nightlight, because she made me sleep with my door open so she could check every 30 minutes. It sounds harsh, I know, but my parents had always been pretty strict too. I guess my dad's coworker figured their influence, as well as the responsibility, would do her some good. Anyway, this one night when she arrived, she seemed quite different. I remember my mom and dad, the poor naive souls, were telling her that it was okay if she didn't feel well and wanted to be driven back home. She refused, telling them she was just a little bit tired and would take a nap once I'd been put down to bed. Boy, did she really seem tired too. She was nodding out as I was eating dinner, was way laxer than she usually was. I remember thinking that if she was like this every time she babysat me in the future, I wouldn't have to dread her arrival anymore. She actually forgot to put me to bed on time too. I got like 45 minutes of extra TV while she napped on the couch. For a while, she was actually sleeping with her phone held up near her face. I thought it was the funniest thing at the time, but if I had known what was actually going on, I wouldn't have thought it so amusing. A few hours later, I woke up incredibly thirsty. I stuck my head out into the hallway and started calling out to her, asking permission to come downstairs and get a glass of water, as we agreed to. For the first time since she'd ever started babysitting me, there was no reply when I called her name. No, oh my god, what do you want now? No, go back to sleep, jeez. Nothing like that. It was complete silence, other than the low hum of the TV from downstairs. I could just feel something was off, but I couldn't tell what exactly. I headed downstairs to try and find her. I grew up in quite a big home, one with an upstairs and a downstairs bathroom. The downstairs bathroom door was only ever closed when it was being used. That clued me into the fact that she must be in there right now. I stood there at the door for a while, actually kind of worried about how much trouble I'd get in for being downstairs after bedtime. But then it hit me. Something had seemed off that night, that she wasn't feeling well. Maybe she was in some kind of trouble herself. I knocked on the door, called out her name again, only to find the door actually opened a little under the force of my knock. People always lock the door when they use the bathroom, don't they? I knew something was wrong here, so I pushed the door open. I saw her sitting there, toilet lid down and slumped back, with something sticking out of her arm. I didn't even recognize it for what it really was in the moment. I didn't know anything about drugs back then. The only needles I'd ever seen were with me facing away from it and wincing, so it's not like I recognized right off the bat. I thought she was just asleep. I honestly thought she was napping. She was leaning back against the toilet, completely slumped over. Any grown-up in their right mind would have known something was wrong right away, but she just looked so peaceful. So peaceful I didn't want to wake her. I just got my glass of water, then went back to drift back off to sleep. Next thing I know, I was woken up to the sound of my mom screaming. Then the rest of the night was kind of a blur for me. The flash of blue and red lights outside, the phone calls and weeping and wailing. Then, almost equally worse, was how my mom and dad seemed to try and forget the whole thing. I think they did so for my sake, so I wouldn't realize how my inaction had actually killed this girl. If I had called someone, they say she would have still been alive, but there's no way I could have known that back then. I'm currently traveling Southeast Asia with my two brothers. We arrived in Saigon this morning. In the evening after dinner and a few beers, me and my two brothers, older and younger, I'm the middle one, decided to sit on a bench in Hao Dan Park and have a quick smoke. We were chatting away, sat on the bench there, when I noticed a Vietnamese man. He was repeatedly looking over at us, walking in circles over and over very near where we were sitting. At first, I wasn't too concerned about him. However, my spider senses were alerted very soon. A minute or two later after I'd first observed him, I noticed another Vietnamese man dressed as a delivery driver, acting suspicious as well, repeatedly glancing over at me and my brothers. The two men were both on the phone. I believe they must have been communicating with each other. Being in a foreign country, my younger brother wanted us to leave. However, it was a good 600-meter walk to the park exit. As we were walking, I noticed both of the Vietnamese men had gotten onto mopeds and were following us on different paths through the park, stopping behind trees and watching us. At some point, they disappeared out of sight. It seemed they'd overtaken us because they were sitting at a bench further down the path waiting for us to cross by. Being aware of this, we left the path and started walking on the grass to the nearest exit as the crow flies. We did our best to avoid the men. We were 100 meters away from the exit when my younger brother looked behind us to see one of the men now sprinting towards us. My younger brother took a fighting stance. He stood his ground against the man and called out to ask what he wanted. Instantly, the man's posture became very small, and he began talking quietly. Both my brother and I kept a good distance and told the man to leave us alone as we walked backwards toward the exit. At that point, we noticed the second assailant also approaching us from a different direction, wearing some motorcycle gear now. My oldest brother decided instead of trying to get out of the situation, he was going to get closer to the whispering Vietnamese man to hear what he was saying. Both me and my younger brother were yelling at him to get the fuck out of here, but he wanted to be a dumbass. It took the Vietnamese guy 5 seconds to explain and win over my older brother's trust. Out of nowhere, when he was leaning in close trying to hear what the man was saying, the Vietnamese man reached out. He grabbed my brother's crotch and started hitting him. He was shocked. I was expecting a fight to break out and be robbed or something. The dong hits were super unexpected. After that, we started shouting, and the men fled immediately. For context, both me and my younger brother are MMA practiced fighters. The whole situation was so unexpected. We didn't engage in any violence towards the men ourselves, just shouting at them. At the end of the story, it was quite wild. Be careful in the parks at night in Vietnam. And to the dong grabbers, I hope we don't meet again. I, female and 22, was parked on the side street of my house with my friend, who is also a woman. I lived next to a dead-end road. The road faces 2 other houses, and all my neighbors parked their cars there. My friend didn't want to be rude to my family and block them in with her car, so she'd parked on the right side of the street. My neighbor has a trailer, the kind you hook onto the back of your car. My friend lives with her parents, and she switches the cars that she uses quite frequently. We were in her dad's old beater Toyota Camry. I didn't get out of the car immediately because I wanted to talk for a little while before I went inside. All of a sudden, my neighbor pulled right up next to our car. He got out of the car and started walking towards us. I know that we made the wrong decision when this happened, but we were afraid. It was after dark, we were both girls, and this was a heavy-set, large man, just to give you a description. My friend reversed and got out of there as he continued to approach us. Her intention was to drive somewhere else and wait for a while before dropping me off. She didn't want me walking inside alone while the guy was still out there. I agreed, and we turned the street to leave. Only that's not what happened. What did happen is that right after we turned, we saw another car following us. At first, we figured it was just another random car, until we realized it was the very same guy in the same truck. We proceeded to drive across town trying to lose him, as he honked his horn and turned his high beams at us, driving on our ass the whole time. We called the police soon after he'd started chasing us, and my friend started driving over to the police station while we were on the phone with the operator. He pulled into the parking lot of the station. The man actually followed us in. We proceeded to drive in circles around the parking lot. About 3 or 4 times he tried to hit us with his car in the lot too. He did this until an officer showed up and blocked him in. We both parked and started talking to the officer. Apparently, because we were in an old beater car and we were parked behind his trailer, he was convinced we were trying to steal from him or something. He was still screaming as he was parked, and the officer was trying to talk to him. The officer told us it was a misunderstanding and told us to simply go home. We went back with me and my friend's mother to the police station to ask about having the officers patrol his area for a while. I'm currently in my house, and this happened in the evening around 10 p.m.-ish. My neighbor got off with a simple warning, and he's back home next door like nothing happened. I don't think I'll be sleeping very well tonight. I know I can't really do anything because he lives right next door. I'm afraid to seek further action in case he gets violent, since he knows where I live. I don't know if he actually thought we were gonna steal from him or what. Maybe he's on drugs or just crazy. But I don't think it's normal to chase people you think are stealing from you across the city. I'm a big fan of horror movies and always have been. I grew up in the 1980s, when horror movies were a lot better and more hardcore than they are nowadays, at least to me. I'm not saying you don't get an occasional good one nowadays, but they're not really anywhere near as fun as they used to be. There was a lot more gore and killing and not as much CGI, just a lot of old school horror and practical effects. A lot of those movies were really gritty as well, not the PG-13 sort of horror you see nowadays. On the weekends, I would normally rent out several movies. Many of them at the time were direct-to-video releases, and I'd have a weekend night marathon to myself. Anyone who grew up on horror and video stores in the 80s has to have fond memories of seeing boxes for movies. You know, Sleepaway Camp, Evil Dead 2, Return to Horror High. Well, I grabbed up mine and hunkered down in my basement bedroom to watch the movies. My family wasn't really into these sorts of films like I was. It didn't really matter to me, though. I was fine to watch all this stuff completely on my own. When I was about 16 years old, I rented out another batch of movies to watch. I even remember exactly which ones. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which surprisingly somehow I'd never seen up to that point, The Hills Have Eyes, and some cheap indie film called Dead Time Stories. None of them seemed tremendously scary to me, I guess, but that wasn't really the point of all this. I had a pretty wild imagination, and I like to force myself to get scared pretty easily. By the time I'd finished watching, it was already well past 2 a.m. I hadn't had anything to eat in a while, so I went up into the main house and made myself something to snack on. I was actually upstairs for about 40 minutes. We weren't allowed to eat in our bedrooms. I had been okay walking around the house upstairs for the most part, but when I went back down to the basement to go to bed, I actually found myself getting quite a bit apprehensive. I couldn't see into the basement at all until I was already halfway down the steps, so I was extremely nervous walking down them. The lights were off at the bottom, so I slowly took each step one at a time, feeling like punching myself for forgetting to turn the light on. Before I got to 4 steps from the bottom, I just jumped the rest of the way down and flipped on the light as quickly as possible. It was kinda weird, and I can't explain to this day why I felt that way, but for some reason I was really freaked out. I assume the movies were probably just sticking with me afterwards. I looked over at the clock on my nightstand and saw it was 3 a.m. now. I started wondering if maybe I should just turn out the light and run over to my bed to go to sleep. The faster I did, the quicker morning would come after all. I would feel silly for being scared. For some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the light out though. Each time I tried, I would hesitate, and I decided that it was going to be light in 2.5 hours anyway. Maybe I should just leave the lights on and watch a comedy movie to calm myself down. Yeah, that was the better option. I turned on the lamp that was sitting on my nightstand and turned off the overhead lights. At this point, only the area around my bed was illuminated. I didn't have many comedies. I popped in an extremely bad film I had seen many times, the pirate movie. As I watched, my eyes kept on shifting toward the windows. I had those basement windows, where a hole was dug into the ground so the basement could get some light. I also glanced over to the closet. I had never been this nervous before after some simple movies. I couldn't figure out exactly why I was so scared. About halfway through, close to 4 a.m., something suddenly caught my eye. I turned over to that window. I'm not sure exactly why I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw the window was actually slightly open. I wondered if that was why I'd felt so paranoid. Perhaps I knew it was open on a subconscious level. I got up out of my bed and went over to close it. About halfway from the bed to the window, though, suddenly I heard a shuffling sound coming from my closet. There was no doubt. Someone was in there. I forgot about that window and took off out of the basement, screaming for my parents to get up and call the police. My dad grabbed his gun and went down to the basement. They caught the guy mid-act, trying to pull himself up and out the window. What we heard from the man was what he told the police. He broke into the basement around the time I was out getting myself that snack. He didn't think anyone was in there, and I'd caught him by surprise when I came back down. I hadn't seen him because it was so dark, so he hid in the closet real quick. I'd been going down the stairs so slowly that he had ample time to do this. For that 1 hour I was watching that movie in the dark, the man was in the closet, watching me through the slits in the door and waiting for me to fall asleep. Fortunately for me, he wasn't gonna come out of that closet until I went to bed. Who knows what he would have done to me if I had. Still though, there's something really unsettling about knowing someone is watching you from inside your own home, and knowing that he was waiting for me to go to sleep the whole time. I used to go to this grindhouse theater in Los Angeles when I was a young teenager. I still get nostalgic for it, even though it really wasn't that nice of a place. It was actually in quite a bad part of town. It wasn't kept up very well either, and attracted a pretty low class of clientele. I figure I can say that without seeming prejudiced because I myself was a member of that low class clientele. From about age 13 onward, I would go and spend a day there. I missed that about those theaters. For less than $5, I could go there around noon, sit in a theater, and watch a bunch of really bad movies all day long. In fact, that became my normal weekend routine for several years on. When I was 15, though, I stopped going to that grindhouse. I had a pretty bad experience there. On this particular day, I can't really tell you what movie I was watching. They all kinda ran together at some point. I remember the experience much more than the movie anyway. Anyway, I was watching the movie and I was actually one of the only few people there. In the middle of the movie though, a group of 5 guys walked into the theater. Normally, I wouldn't have paid them any attention, except they all came right to where I was sitting and sat all around me. That really irritated me because the theater was practically empty. My irritation was only going to get worse. These guys began talking really loud throughout the movie and were pretty vulgar and not shy about it either. They kept talking back to the screen and laughing at the most inappropriate moments. I was beginning to get really aggravated, although I knew there wasn't much, if anything, I could do about it. Remember, this was kind of a run-down grindhouse theater, so they didn't have an usher. There was a guy working tickets and another guy working the snack counter, but that was about all the personnel there. I tried to drown out the men and watch the movie. Only it started to get worse. The guy behind me started to kick the back of my chair. Not just lightly tapping it, full-on kicking it with all his might. These guys were obviously trying to get me to yell at them or get irritated, and I was definitely getting irritated. Once again, I tried my best to ignore it, but they started harassing me so much I just couldn't anymore. I decided to get up and leave. These were 5 guys much older than me, at least in their late 20s, and I was one 15-year-old. It would have been stupid for me to start a fight all on my own. As I was leaving, they started making chicken sounds at me, of course, and calling me names. I did my best to shrug it off. It wasn't easy, but I did leave with my head held high. I was really upset. Once I left, I would have to pay again to go back into the theater and watch more movies. That was assuming they wouldn't be there all day, too. I decided it was still early enough for me to stick around a bit. I had the idea to kinda wait it out in the bathroom stall for a while until they left. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but I really didn't want to leave and have to spend more money. It was only about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I wanted to do more that day. Surely the guys had had their fun. When they realized I'd left, they would eventually leave too, and I could go back in safe and sound. After I had been sitting there for quite a while, though, I heard the door open. I cringed, thinking that it might have been the guys who were sitting around me. I realized how stupid I was, and I probably should have just left the damn theater. I felt a bit calmer when I realized it was just one person, not 5. That calmness did not last very long, though. Whoever this was walking very slowly, taking deliberate steps right up to me. I pulled my feet up further to hide myself in the stall. The slow steps continued, and by this point I could see the feet of the person on the other side of the door. He walked right over and stopped right in front of it. He didn't try to open the door, but he did begin to tap on it. I emphasize it was a tapping and not a knocking, because he was using some sort of object to do it. My anxiety was peaking, and I cursed myself again for not just leaving. He took the object and slid it in between the space and the door. I almost had a heart attack. It was a switchblade. I felt tears begin to form in my eyes. I was convinced this person was going to kill me. I couldn't do anything except remain on the toilet seat, practically crying to myself. The man took the knife and slid it up and down in the space before pulling it out. I could hear him doing something, but I wasn't sure what it was. It sounded like he was fumbling around. He then threw something over the stall onto me and ran out of the bathroom. I grabbed the object in surprise, then dropped it to the ground in terror when I realized it was a decapitated crow's head. Scared for my life, I got up and opened the stall. As I did, I noticed he had written something on the stall door in what I figured was the blood of that crow. It was my first name. Somehow, that guy knew my name. I was out of that place, and I didn't care that there was no usher in the building. I went right to the ticket counter and told them what happened, and they called the cops. Actually, they were very nice and let me into the ticket booth as I waited for the cops to show up. All 5 guys were long gone by that point, though the cop was nice enough to give me a ride home. I have no idea how that guy knew my name. All I know is that I never saw any of those guys again, and I never went back to that grindhouse either. I've seen a few arcades around nowadays, but not nearly as many as they had back when I was growing up. The ones they have now were very different as well. Of course, the games are much more advanced, but that's not all that I mean. Maybe I'm just getting old. I don't know, but there's something about those old 80s style arcades that just fills me with a wonderful sense of nostalgia. I remember when standing around watching others play Pac-Man was a big deal. I never thought we would reach a time period where any video game was bigger than Pac-Man was. Now though, he's pretty much just an afterthought. I guess one of the better things about the arcades of today is that they tend to be in better parts of town and nicer buildings as well. The few I see are, at least in places like GamesWorks, all in areas that seem to be very low crime and are kept very clean and well maintained. In the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of people may not remember this, but arcades were really looked down upon by most people. Before Pac-Man was released, kids didn't even really hang out at arcades. They attracted an older group. Smoking, lots of drinking, very prominent dark stuff in arcades. Most people credit Pac-Man with being the game that brought children in, but even after Pac-Man, they didn't automatically become the nicest and safest places to be. I mention Pac-Man a lot because it has some relevance to my story. The game Pac-Land came out around 1984, and I was obsessed with wanting to play it. It basically just involved Pac-Man walking to the end of town, grabbing these magic boots, then running back to the beginning of the board, one of the earliest side-scrolling games. The only problem was that in the arcade I went to, I never really got a chance to play. I was 11 years old at the time, and that game always had a line of people waiting for it. An 11-year-old would never be able to get to the front of the line. My big break came though when Gauntlet was released in 1985. That game became the big video game of that arcade, freeing up most of the other machines in the place. I was 12 at this time, and I often headed down to the arcade on weekends by myself. My parents didn't really care. They didn't take any interest in what I did. The arcade I'd go to was in a crappy part of town right next to a 7-Eleven that had a pretty bad reputation as a gang hangout. The building itself was very dirty and was always loud due to the combination of noise from the games and the fact they were always playing extremely loud rock music. On this particular day, I got into the arcade when I noticed a large amount of people hanging out by the Gauntlet machine. There were other people scattered throughout, but not many. Gauntlet was a bit revolutionary for the time, since 4 people could play simultaneously. I became very excited. My expectations were that I would finally be able to play Pac-Land. Finally, I went to the part of the arcade where the game was, and was astounded to find it being played by only one person, an older teenager. Not to my surprise, really. The arcade had a rule that if you wanted to play a game after someone, you go up to the game and place a quarter upon it. That would save the game for you for the next turn. Excitedly, I ran up, took out my quarter, and put it down on the game. The guy playing it, momentarily distracted, turned and gave me a dirty look. I didn't really care because I was finally going to get to play this game. When he died, though, the guy didn't let me take my turn. In fact, he took my quarter, slid it into the game, and began playing. I tried to protest in anger, but the guy just ignored me. I was so pissed off, but I couldn't do anything on my own. I went to speak with the guy at the counter, who exchanged dollars for quarters. I told him what happened. He came over to the Pac-Man game and confronted the guy. Like he had done with me, the teenager basically ignored the worker at first. The worker got annoyed with the guy for ignoring him, more than what he'd done to me. He told the guy he had to return my quarter to me. The teenager just ignored him again. The worker then put his hand on the guy's shoulder. The guy playing the game did not like that at all. He turned around and punched the worker right in the face. It only took a couple of moments before another guy who worked there, some sort of security or bouncer type, came over and threw the guy from the arcade. I smiled at him smugly as he was dragged out. As he was leaving, he threatened to find me and attack me. I finally got to play Pac-Land though, so I didn't care. I not only got to play it, but I played it a lot, so much that I completely lost track of time. It was already dark before I realized it. I still had to get home, so I left the arcade. Walking home, I started to hear footsteps not far behind me. It wasn't too weird of a thing, really. It was a pretty big neighborhood. As I made several turns onto different blocks, though, they kept following me. Feeling a bit apprehensive, I tried to glance behind me to see who it was. I'm sure you're not surprised to be told it was that teenager I'd pissed off earlier. He looked to be carrying what looked like the leg of a coffee table. Scared, I began to run, and I heard him chasing behind me. I cursed myself over and over for looking back, and stupidly did so again. My foot got caught on an uneven crack between the sidewalk blocks, and I fell face first onto the ground. I didn't realize in the moment, but the impact broke my nose. I did know right away that my face was covered in blood. When I turned up, I noticed the man coming closer to me. I saw it actually was a coffee table leg, with one long screw pointing out of the end. As he came closer, he said something I'll never forget. "You want to go to Packland? I'll send you to Packland." He wasn't upon me yet, so I went for broke. I jumped up and ran to the nearest house, pounding on the door, yelling and screaming bloody murder. I didn't even know whose house it was, but I didn't care. And the people who lived there answered the door immediately, and fortunately for me, ran the teenager off. The people in that house were also kind enough to call my parents, who took me to the emergency room and forbade me from ever going to the arcade again. I was very upset, of course, but they did buy me a ColecoVision, and the very first game they got me was Pac-Land, so I was satisfied. A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my hometown as a driver. I was 27, but made damn good money delivering. I'd worked at a few other places, both local and chain, in the years before, and still work as a dasher on occasion, even after this happened. Now I choose to deliver in much safer areas though, for this exact reason. I got luckier than I could ever imagine. One night I was working and I had a double, 2 deliveries to take. Both were cash orders. I had $12 left in my bank, which drivers are given to use as change for cash orders, so you don't have to have a ton of cash on you at all times. The first order went smoothly. The guy gave me $50 for a $35 order, so I was excited about the nice tip. I drove to the second delivery. It was an apartment complex with multiple buildings. I had delivered there before, in fact. The sun was about to set, but it was still very light out. The chain I worked at had us drive company cars with the logo on them, all white sedans. I grabbed the order and went to the door of the apartment building. A young guy came out. A much bigger, older guy was outside smoking a cigarette. The big guy went inside as the smaller guy came out. He looked around nervously and asked how much he owed me. The way he was looking around just made me very nervous too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told him the amount, and he said that wasn't what he was told on the phone. Immediately, something felt wrong. I felt someone else walk out behind me from the door, as the first young guy looked around down the parking lot, craning his neck as if he was looking for someone. I told him the amount again, and broke down the order for him, trying to keep calm. Then the first guy held a gun right to my temple. I felt a poke on my spine. 2 gunmen. I couldn't speak. Words wouldn't form no matter how hard I tried. "Give me your money and keys now," the first guy growled. I fumbled immediately for the keys. I gave him my bank but hadn't realized the 50 was mixed in. I gave him the keys, trying my best to remain calm. Another guy came from my left. He had poofy hair and was around the same age as the first kid. The one behind me I hadn't seen yet. The big-haired kid grabbed the pizza bag and ran off and hid. The first one searched the company car. Luckily, I had left my wallet in my personal car. I saw him grab my cell phone. That's when the panic began to set in. I had pictures on that phone that I hadn't backed up of my then 5-year-old son, who's absolutely my world. Please don't take that. I have pictures of my son who died on there. It's all I have of him, please." I lied. My son was very much alive. The kid behind me spoke softly. "Trust me, just listen to him. You'll get it back undamaged. I don't want to be here either." I could tell he'd been crying by how his voice sounded. A car began pulling in, and the 3 boys took off to the other end of the complex in a full sprint. Before the one behind me ran, he dropped the gun right in front of me. Standard issue 9mm silver and black, safety off. Looked real enough to me. He picked it back up and ran off with the others. The car that pulled in saw me. A woman and her kid, it seemed. Panic set in as I realized they could easily come back and do way worse to me, and the sky was starting to get dark. I had collapsed. They had taken the company car keys, $72, the pizza, and my phone. The woman ran up to me and asked if I was alright. She took me into her apartment in the next building over and locked the door. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hold her phone to talk to 911 as she sat down her kid. Her boyfriend, I assumed, helped me call. I spoke to the operator and told them everything. I'm colorblind. Thankfully, these guys were all wearing black and white clothes. I had a full description of two of them. The poor woman who helped me was going to be late for work, but she stayed until I was off the phone and the cops had shown up. Man, she was harsh and blunt with the operator. I'll never forget this woman's utter kindness to me, though, and her boyfriend's as well. The cops showed up and contacted my store. My manager brought out the spare keys for me to drive the car back. After dealing with the cops, I drove back and was greeted by crying and beyond worried coworkers. All of them were terrified I'd been killed or something. It meant a lot to me to see how much they cared. I told them I was fine. I filed the proper paperwork, and the $72 was written off as a loss to the store. Thank God, because I had worked other stores that make you pay back the money out of pocket if you get robbed, to prevent drivers from stealing. The owner told me to take the rest of the night off and take care of myself. He gave me a hug as well. Guy was one of the best bosses I ever had. What I didn't know yet was that I was in for a much longer night still. I called my best friend before I left the store from the store phone and asked where he was. We usually met up for drinks after work, and he was around the corner at a bar. I met up with him. His dad was a District 4 cop in my city at the time, the same district this happened in. He told me his dad had given him a heads up, and he had 2 shots waiting for me to calm my nerves. We had begun playing pool when his dad called his cell phone and asked if I was with him yet. He said yeah and handed me the phone. His dad asked if I could come down to the station. I was honest and told him I'd had some to drink, so he sent out a squad car to get me. We got down to the station and they had the suspects in custody. All I needed was to ID them. 3 boys and a driver. They'd been caught less than 20 minutes after the robbery speeding. The bolo had already gone out, and they matched the description perfectly. They used the money to buy weed and gas and took off. They had at least 15 stolen cell phones on them. The order had been placed on a stolen phone. My phone was in the mix in a box. The police told me to grab my phone only, and I did so. They asked me to unlock it. It had fingerprint verification, so that was easy enough. I noticed that 9 of the 10 tries to unlock it had already been used before my phone would completely reset. It unlocked right away. I told the police every detail yet again, although my parental instincts kicked in. I told them the guy behind me quite obviously had been bullied into this, and to show that guy some mercy, the only guy in a white shirt. The police told me he was the only one that was talking. The other 3 denied involvement. And that's when I found out about the 4th guy, the driver. We found out later he was completely unaware of anything and just happened to be picking up his friends. He was never charged. The boy who was behind me and the one who grabbed the pizza were 15 and 16 and got 6 months of house arrest. The only reason the one behind me got off easy, despite having the gun to my back, was because I asked them to go easy on him. He was the only one that was confessing as well. Makes sense since he even said the other guy wouldn't have the phone for long. He was planning on going to the cops had they not been caught in the first place. The other guy, the first kid who put the gun to my temple, it was his 18th birthday, so he got the full book thrown at him. In the courtroom, he tried to make fun of me and was laughing at me. Seeing him made me panic. The judge scolded him for his behavior, and he just grinned and glared at me like the Joker. All I could see was pure evil. I know that kid will commit more crimes. No doubt eventually he'll end someone's life. You could see how cold he was just by looking into his eyes. I never want to see that again. I asked to have my name stricken from the records, and asked to remain anonymous in case he ever got out. I'm glad I did, because today I got a letter from the state, and he's being released in February. The court only had my old address, and my mom didn't think the letter was important. I missed the deadline to protest his release for probation. The plea deal was for 8 years, but it's only been 4, getting out early due to overcrowding. Not good behavior, just overcrowding. This coming February,